So I'll tell you how I got into what I got into, and it's a little bit about, I think, the decision process for entrepreneurs. A lot of, so first I'll tell you a little bit about the origin of Upstart, and then I'll just talk about my decision process, because that's actually, I think, somewhat pertinent here. So it was about a year ago that I had some conversations with kids who were going into their senior year of college, or sort of in that age group of like approaching the end of their college, or in a couple of cases grad school, and saying, what do you want to do next year? This sort of thing you would normally ask somebody, what are you going to do when you graduate? And what I saw multiple times was kids who had something they were really excited about, passionate about, and it was typically something, roughly speaking, entrepreneurial in nature, but not all tech startup, anything like that. This was like, I have this research I'm working on with a professor that could turn into something we don't know. I have a friend who's doing a startup. I have this, all these different notions. I want to actually, build furniture. I want to do this, something, all these different things that I kept hearing. But I'm going to instead go with plan B and take this job from the on-campus recruiter. And now, that may sound like, of course, that happens all the time, but I was just like, wow, that's really interesting. Why you're doing that? And it was the usual reasons you'd expect. This thing's very risky. I don't know about it. It doesn't, and this is a job and a paycheck. And, I have loans. I have these other obligations. So it was sort of like that process. And I really started to think about it. I also sort of layered onto it the fact that I was at Google, and I'm thinking how we would hire hundreds of kids out of school every year. We got quite analytic in looking at how to assess who would be successful at Google, right? Because Google is like sort of tries to be data-driven about everything. So, we would, of course, look at schools and majors and GPAs, but a lot of more subtle things like that. We actually care a lot about your SAT score, even though God knows that was so, even for, senior in college, that's something you did a long time ago. And we would care about the trajectory of your GPA, not just your absolute GPA, things like that. And so we got pseudo, analytic about how to do that. And then I thought at the same time, these kids that we felt we could analyze and make a good assessment on were essentially illiquid. I mean, they had, as most students do, a lot of students have loans. They have little or no access to credit other than credit cards, which is a very dangerous road to head down. And the world essentially has deemed you unworthy of credit. So you're essentially in this very tight space at a point in your life where you're making a decision that potentially affects you for a long time, all for what in the grand scheme of the economy is modest amounts of money, and also sort of a lack of sort of help or guidance on pursuing that plan A. And I was literally sitting at Google. Somebody came to lunch who I was chatting about with this. And I know it was a year ago because I sat there and I went on my phone and I actually registered the domain. It was not Upstart that I registered. It was liquidgrad.com, which I still own. Because that was my first notion of this was, wow, like there's no liquidity here. These people have potential. And that potential, should mean that they should have access to capital, yet for some reason they don't. There's no liquidity. And so I went and got liquidgrad.com. Fortunately, I have tabled that one. And I know this because I just got the renewal notice from the domain registrar. So that was the first notion. And as I pushed the idea forward, I said, like, why is it that we can't, why is it that more people who want to become entrepreneurs, in the broadest sense of that term, I don't mean tech entrepreneurs or anything, but really want to go their own way, why is there no way for them to, in effect, borrow from their future, to borrow based on, with their future as the collateral? And so, Upstart really became the notion of a crowdfunding platform that, through one lens, looks a heck of a lot like Kickstarter. You can raise, you create a profile. In our case, it's about you, not your project. You raise capital, you have backers. But the real quid pro quo that's very different and somewhat radical is that you actually pay back a fixed fraction of your personal income over a period of 10 years with a couple of twists in it. But the idea is a very small percentage. And the idea generally is if we can give you a bit of economic window of freedom, that might be to pay or retire off some loans, have living expenses covered for 6 months or a year, relocate somewhere, whatever it might be, even the very beginnings of starting a company, that can actually make a huge impact on your life, even though, again, in the broad scheme of what you're going to earn over your life, $20,000 or $30,000 won't actually mean that much to that. So, and what if we could pair that with backers who could help you on that path? who, even though this money that they're putting in probably for them isn't enormously material to their wealth, but will be skin in the game where they can help you and be on your team, be sort of a personal advisor to you, or even a mentor. And so that's what Upstart's become. Now, just to go back to me and my story, so this was last September, and I'm sitting here running this like 1,000+ person team at Google, and going like, wow, would I ever jump off and like go to ground zero and run a 0-person team? Because that's sort of what I was faced with. And I went through a process of saying, could this really be a business? I just got very calculated about it and said, here's 4 things I wanted to prove, which I won't go into, but which said, if I can believe these things, then I think it can be a business. And I sort of went through it with, I had scarce little time, so through some proxies, I had some research done on campuses to see if people cared about this and would be helpful or not. I kind of got help from some lawyers to talk about the legal and regulatory part of it. And it was about February where I kind of said, I think this can work. And I think, if there's any lesson out of that process, I think that struck me eventually was, because I literally tried several times to forget about it. It's not obvious that you should walk away from a great company. Just about when I'm ready to think I'm going to leave, Google wins like best place to work in the world, like 5th year in a row, just to reinforce like what an idiotic decision I'm about to make. So, and of course my wife is like, really? You're going to, I don't, my 6-year-old, don't even start. He's made it very clear to me, Upstart is not as good as Google. He did ask me whether he can still continue to use Google, and I said, covered there. So, but the lesson learned really was when you can't put it away, because like I said, I tried to put it away, I would end up in more and more conversations again with other people about it. It became clear that this was something I wasn't just going to let fade away. And ultimately, whether a financial advisor or my wife or my child or whomever, friends, would recommend it or not, I knew I had to do it. And I ultimately came down to the fundamental concept that in life you typically regret the things you don't do more than the things that you do. And so I left off, and in March I informed my employer I was leaving, and then in the beginning of April, Upstart was born.